Good morning. Week 2. So, first thing I'm going to be working on is that we've identified through a combination of playtesting ourselves and attracting a playtester who's a bit of a Tetris diehard, we've identified something that is somewhat antithetical to the design language and to the flow state of Tetris. So in Tetris, you have your pit and you have some blocks coming in. Part of this is that the blocks can never stop, and that's part of the flow of Tetris, and that's part of the challenge of Tetris, is that it doesn't matter what happens and it doesn't matter how quickly this environment starts working, the blocks will always spawn. So we ran into some challenges early on that required us to consider what to do with this in our environment. So let's consider player, and there's some environmental tile here, which is something that doesn't exist in hardline Tetris. So this is an environment tile. This is one of the grey blocks that you'll see in Tetramino's environment. The logic that drives the spawner at the moment is such that there is a zone here, player is here, this zone is in some absolute relative position, so it's got a y offset and an x offset to the player, and then blocks can always spawn within this zone. And what the spawner does is it queries the grid management system. So there's a grid management system that allots the entities to the grid space in the world and keeps track of who's where, what's occupied, what's not occupied, etc. So this spawner queries this X and Y array of positions and checks, are there any positions in here that would be sufficient for me to spawn a block? So right now, obviously, it would spawn it could spawn a line piece like this. Piece doesn't exist, but a piece like that. It would be able to spawn it like that happily in order to avoid overlapping with this environment block, because it's a fact of Tetramino's world that blocks can never occupy the same space. They should never be able to overlap. So that's how the spawner works at the moment. What that creates, though, is because we're borrowing so much design language from Tetris, it creates an oddity where if I did have the situation where we just have, environment tiles blocking the spawn area, now there's nowhere for a block to spawn. What our spawner actually does in that case is it puts up this interface element. It puts up this interface element that says blocked, and it overlays this over this area to inform the user how your spawner is blocked, and then it becomes part of the game to position your player so that the spawner isn't blocked. And that works fine in Tetramino. What it does, though, is it interrupts the flow of running, which we've identified obviously being a runner game. It's quite important that you keep running. The forward momentum is the entire point of the entire premise of the game and the scoring system. And then having this blocked here and saying, blocks can't spawn now, it alienates a little bit the Tetris crowd, who has that ingrained kind of sensibilities around, blocks can always spawn. That's just one of the rules of life, is that a block will always spawn. The challenge is that it happens faster and faster, and you have to navigate that no matter what speed it's happening at. You don't get a break at any point. So those two things combined is probably enough for me to want to do something about it, because on the one hand, antithetical to the Tetris design language, and I don't want to alienate any of those fans that there might be, because this is a Tetris derivative game. On the other hand, it's antithetical to the idea of a runner where you must always have some way to make forward progression. So whilst the blocked language is clear, it's easy to read, it was easy to implement, this smart spawner that we have works really well. There's probably enough reasons to change that it's a worthwhile piece of work. So what we're gonna try to build today is something that's likely going to cause some weirder edge cases and be a little more complex, but should solve these problems. So we have the player, and then we have some, there won't be a spawn area anymore. There's going to be an absolute spawn point. And at that spawn point, I guess that's the other thing I'm taking for granted here, is obviously like an understanding of how this feels and looks in the world. So another byproduct of this spawn area is that blocks, in any one spawn, your block could spawn like up here, or could spawn down here, or up in the top left corner. Like there's a variability about where your blocks can spawn. So this new system, there would not be that. So if I were a line piece, I might spawn in, like so. If I were a T piece, it might be like so, obviously with our normal random rotation. It will always be around this center point. I might even use the Tetris blocks have in Tetramino have an absolute pivotal center, which we use to perform the matrix operations to make the block pivot, like rotate on the spot, but without changing its position. So it has a mathematical like center. We use that center maybe as what aligns with the spawn point. And what's going to happen is if there is an environment tile here and we're wanting to spawn in a Tetris block, and let's say the Tetris block is slated to spawn in here, obviously with this overlap on that position, what is going to happen is that the Tetris block will spawn in. The player now has control of it. It will spawn in as a ghost, as like a transparent version of the block. And then only once the player has then moved it completely like the normal way, so this is just in their normal play. So let's say they like dive and send that because their aspiration is to put it in this position. Then when the block reaches here, it would become solid, and its collisions, colliders will be calculated, and it will become an interactable block as of that moment. So here we're prioritizing blocks always spawning in the same spot, always spawning at the same cadence, and we're prioritizing those factors in order to honor, that Tetris truth. And we're prioritizing that over the reality we have in the world at the moment, which is no two blocks can ever overlap in any conditions, which has been, it's been one of the pillars of the space, but I think there is enough justification to change that now. So this is going to be the new system. So the challenges in this is obviously I need this, shadow state for the blocks to be in. Currently, colliders on my Tetris pieces are dynamically calculated because some block like this, I can't prefabricate these colliders for a handful of reasons. If I do just build the Tetraminos out of individual blocks like this, and that block is a prefab and the spawner just assembles Tetris shapes, then you have these little creases in between where the corner of one collider meets the corner of the other collider. And when you've got a velocity like this and the player velocity like this, maybe the player collider, whether it be circular, square, whatever, can actually collide with this corner and cause a little pop up in the air. So there is a system on the Tetramino that is responsible for breaking this shape down into its largest parts and assembles dynamic colliders at that point. So this would actually be made up of a collider like this and then a collider like this. So that when this is upside down, like this, we have a smooth surface along here for the player to move along. So that dynamic system will not calculate any colliders. So there'll just be no collision on this object until the player moves it into a legal space, and then the collision will be calculated and it'll become a real block. So that is what I am kicking off Monday morning, bright and early, on week 1 with. Wish me the best of luck.